Dead Ringers, I'll be looking at both versions. So this image is from the new remake in 2023, the TV series produced by Amazon and kind of written and produced by Alice Birch along with Rachel Weisz, who stars as both the twins, Beverly and Elliot Mantle. And also looking at David Cronenberg's film from 1988, where Jeremy Irons played the twins. But first, I just want to talk a bit about liminality, because there are lots of ways that you could approach Dead Ringers, either version. There's a huge amount in them in terms of women's bodies, how we understand science, the role of doctors in society, twins, all kinds of issues. But Ellie mentioned the book that this talk is based on, a chapter that I'm writing for this book, Darkest Margins, about liminality in horror. And I thought that Dead Ringers works really well for that subject because it manages to combine kind of several different ways of thinking about liminal spaces. And what do I mean by that? So liminality is a term that is really popular in cultural studies now. People will use it in quite loose ways, which I think is not a bad thing. And I think in film studies or in looking at visual media, it's one of the mediums in which you can bring lots of different approaches together through the visual form. So liminality is rooted in anthropology in terms of rites of passage, and the liminal stage is the transitional stage when you come out of one status before you move into another in society. It's rooted in architecture in terms of those spaces in a building that are neither like one room or another, and not a corridor, but the space before the entryway to another place. So an example would be like a vestibule, the kind of space between the outside door and the inside door. So you're not either quite outside and you're not quite inside. It's not a space that you stay in for very long. It's a space that is about communication between one chamber and another. And it works in a kind of psychological sense as well. And that very much plays out in both versions of Dead Ringers in terms of how you can follow the psychological state of the twins and also, in some ways, the patients that they're dealing with. And I think because, in terms of the anthropological approach to liminality, it makes sense that this kind of structure of a rite of passage, the idea of kind of separation from your original state, transition, and then re-entry into society in the new status. So that might be growing up, teenagehood as a liminal state between childhood and adulthood, for example. That this is kind of a common structure for storytelling in our society. It's the standard structure of popular stories, that something happens, a catalyst, some change comes about that throws people out of their regular day-to-day life into a transitional stage, and then there's some kind of resolution where they're able to re-enter a new normal. And in lots of ways in storytelling, all of the best stuff, the most thrilling bits of the story happen in that liminal stage, in that transition. And in horror, I think it's particularly the way that there's not always the reintegration, the reincorporation into society. Horror often keeps us stuck in the liminal space, in that transitional space where the old rules don't apply, but you can't quite seem to move on to a new stage. And there's also a question of if you can't be reincorporated, if you can't learn the rules that you're meant to learn to become an adult or, whatever the next stage of your life is supposed to be. Or what if you look at what you're meant to re-enter and you don't want to? If anyone saw Mi Bestia on Wednesday night that was shown here, a film about a teenager, she kind of gets a sense of what the rules are in adult life that she's meant to be moving towards and doesn't really want to do that. This is not a stage that she wants to be incorporated into. And so I think in the horror genre and kind of things like Dead Ringers that overlap, with psychological drama, and so on, it works really well looking at it through this space. of not being able to escape or not wanting to leave the liminal space. So both versions play with these ideas of liminality, and they are both, of course, set around a topic which is in itself kind of a rite of passage in our society, the idea of fertility. And Dead Ringers plays out in a fertility clinic. The twin doctors, the Mantle twins, are gynaecologists. They are there to guide women through fertility issues, to try and help them have a baby and move on to that stage of parenthood. But of course, this is a rite of passage that doesn't have any guarantees, really, except if you can pay for it. And I think this is what Rachel Weisz's version really takes on in a big way, is the profit motive in modern healthcare in the USA today, and who has access to the best kind of care and treatment that can help you through that stage, maybe with less ceremony, less like a rite of passage as we might have an idea of it in our head, but certainly with these gatekeepers who decide who gets to move through that liminal stage of trying to conceive of pregnancy, and hoping for an outcome of a successful transition to motherhood or parenthood. And I think Dead Ringers brings together, so that kind of anthropological element, but also the psychological and the anatomical, which maps quite well onto the architecture that I talked about earlier. If you look up vestibule, for example, I'll come to the reason why I did that in a minute. Vestibule in architecture is an entryway to another chamber. A vestibule in anatomy is the entryway to what they call it, into a canal. If you look up vestibule anatomy, it's all about ear canals. If you look up vestibule anatomy female, it's all about vulvas, like women don't have ears. It's kind of it maps on this idea of this space that you're not meant to stay in, but it's something that kind of separates two spaces, or maybe outside and inside, but allows for communication, for to and fro. And the entryway to the vagina, to the womb, is very important in Dead Ringers. Now, I think in the form of visual storytelling, you can combine all of those kind of different aspects of liminality, and through these characters of the identical twins, have that psychological drama playing out, and also think about how they act on other people's bodies and on their own bodies, because they do both in each version. And of course, it's interesting in itself that in the original film, the twins are men, they're called Beverly and Elliot. In the remake, the twins are women, they're called Beverly and Elliot. These names work for both. There's already this kind of gender ambiguity built into the first film, which allows for this remake to pick that up and do something with it. And yeah, coming back to the term vestibule, I looked this up because I read that David Cronenberg referred to the title sequence of a film as a vestibule that carries you from your seat in the cinema into the world of the film. And I think the opening sequence of his film is interesting for that. So I'll just play a bit of it. Got quite calming music. I find it oddly calming with the way that it's moving slowly, but also you're looking at these instruments. Are they medical? Are they torture instruments? What is going on? And these come up later in the film when Beverly Mantle is kind of psychologically breaking down and designs instruments for mutant women, as he calls them. And it was interesting that the designers of this title sequence, before they put together their ideas and made the pitch, they thought they should spend a day with David Cronenberg, see what he's thinking about this film, and they noticed on his desk the catalogue for a exhibition of medieval torture instruments that he'd been to in Florence. and they'd been to the same exhibition. So they bonded over these medieval torture instruments and then thought, this is it, this is our pitch. And they went away and designed this title sequence. So it kind of brings in, obviously inspired by the kind of drawings you would see in medieval science books, but also the kind of these torture instruments and medical textbooks, and they combine those things in a way that flags up some of what is going to happen in the film, even though the tone feels very different. But of course, all on this blood red background. And the colour red in both versions is very important in terms of how the doctors dress, and also in terms of blood and the insides of bodies, which is something you see quite a lot of. I'll just, let it run to the end, because it also brings in this idea of kind of cultural ideas about twins, the kind of slight fear of twins and doubling. And this is the Mantle retractor, which we'll come back to. This is the tool that the twins had invented at university. This is part of how they've become these renowned doctors. So it introduces these kind of themes of fear, the history of science and medicine, the connections between medicine and torture. And these, again, are themes that the new version of Dead Ringers comes back to in quite a strong way. And the new version is quite different and made for a different medium. So made for TV, something that you might watch on your TV, on your laptop, on your phone. You might be anywhere. You're not going to be in a cinema seat needing to be transported into a different world. You want to be grabbed. Now, it does have a title sequence a little later, but the first thing you get before episode 1, in small writing, warning for nudity, violence, substance use, alcohol use, smoking, foul language, sexual content. Normal stuff. And then in huge writing, childbirth is going to happen, and I laughed at this when I saw it, but then if you actually watch episode 1, it is actually quite horrific, because they do show these really graphic, just perfectly safe-looking, clean, clinical, but medicalised childbirth in the Mantle clinic. And so in the first episode, it's kind of very fast, going through all these different bodies, different women on tables giving birth or just having given birth, different stories being told. It all looks clean, it all looks safe, in a sense, but it also feels very detached from the human being who is going through this important stage of giving birth to another human being. It feels very clinical. And I think there's very much a critique of this kind of medicalised idea of childbirth, coming from the programme in terms of how it shows you this happening, but also coming just verbally through the character of Beverly Mantle, who wants to argue for a different model, a human-centred model of childbirth. She, says pregnancy is not a disease. This shouldn't be a hospital. It should be a birthing centre where we allow women to control, and feel comfortable and in charge of their of the process they're going through. The title sequence of the series is like a miniature version of the clinic. So it's like a little model with the clinic, with lots of happy couples cradling their newborn babies, competent doctors, efficient nurses. Again, it's all kind of pale blue and white and very clinical and clean. And so it feels like we're entering this very safe, modern space where they're very much in control of this process. But then it cuts immediately to the first scene after the title sequence, which is Beverly having a miscarriage. And this is not something that you often see portrayed or even talked about very much, an early miscarriage. It's in the first few weeks of pregnancy. And you can tell by her demeanour that it's not the first one she's had, which we later have confirmed. She notices the blood on the toilet, and then she picks the embryo out of the toilet and talks to it, and then goes to tell her sister another bloody miscarriage. So clearly she's trying to conceive herself, and despite being a successful, world-renowned doctor and gynaecologist, they're not able to control this process fully either. This slide is not upside down. This is kind of Beverly's view from lying down of Elliot coming to give her an examination after the miscarriage just to check what's happening. I just thought this was notable because it was the first time I've seen a realistic depiction of a scan. You know, on TV normally they always show, whenever there's a scan to do with pregnancy, it'll be the nice over the belly thing. It all seems very pleasant, but in reality most of the time they're going to stick a massive wand up your vagina and wiggle it around, and that's what she's about to do. You know, so it was just nice to see a realistic portrayal. And it's quite good the way that they discuss this, that Beverly, you know, because she keeps having she's had recurrent miscarriages now. We learn that Elliot's been trying to, has been creating the embryos for IVF, basically, to try and get Beverly pregnant. And Beverly's feeling is, my body keeps fucking it up. That's what she says. You know, she feels it's somehow her body isn't doing the right things. And again, this kind of echoes the talk in the Cronenberg film about mutant women and women's bodies are not right. And this is something that I'll come back to in terms of the Cronenberg one. This idea that if something goes wrong with fertility, it's about the woman somehow. But the effect is that Beverly is kind of stuck in this limbo of trying to conceive, along with a lot of the patients that they're dealing with who will come to this clinic, which in itself is like a kind of limbo, where they enter with these hopes of coming out the other side with a successful pregnancy, but some of them get stuck and can't seem to leave that space. You know, they're a mother-to-be, but they're never a mother. And it's this... By making the doctors women in the new version, they're able to make them much more part of that story as well. But it's about how fertility is seen as and talked about as a women's issue, even though of course men can struggle with fertility also, you know, and the reason for a couple not being able to conceive might be the man, might be the woman, you know, or it might be both. It's, you know, it's not as simple. In the Cronenberg film, one of the patients who's had all the tests and all the examinations you can possibly have with the Mantles says, well, look, there's nothing wrong with me. Can you check my husband? And the Mantle twin that she's talking to is like, we don't do husbands. You know, we make women fertile. That's what we do. You know, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation. And in the new version, they don't say anything like that. But there aren't really hardly any men in it. You know, in the new version, almost everyone is women. You know, the two doctors are women, of course. Their patients are women. Beverly ends up in a relationship with a woman. They get funding from a billionaire family. She's a woman. Her partner's a woman. You know, they've kind of simplified things, I guess, in a sense, of making it about the profit motive in terms of the billionaire and their role, and making it about, you know, not men experimenting on women, but women experimenting on themselves and each other, which changes the dynamic in interesting ways. So coming back to this idea of liminality and storytelling, the first stage in the kind of anthropological rite of passage is separation. So this is about, you know, you had an old way of being, a particular status, and something happens or time passes and that changes and you enter into this transitional stage before hopefully re-entering in a new stage. So the Mantle twins start out as this incredibly successful, world-renowned doctors, high status in society, seen as people who are leading women through this process, almost like priests. And I think you can see that in terms of how they're represented. This is in Cronenberg's film, you know, the gowns that they wear in the operating theatre. There's hats as well. And he almost looks just like a priest, just standing there. like, I am here to guide you, you know, I am the expert, the one who will guide you through this process. And they do the same, you know, same kind of gowns in the new version. And you'll notice in both, they're in a operating theatre, but actually also presenting to an audience outside. So even when there are rooms in these buildings, they're not enclosed spaces. They have massive windows, and there's always someone looking in. You know, so even kind of an enclosed space like an operating theatre becomes a liminal space in both versions of Dead Ringers, because it's always permeable. You're always looking in and into where they're cutting open women's bodies. In this scene, this is Elliot Mantle, and she's doing a presentation to these lot, who are some of the wealthy backers of the new clinic. So these are some of the people whose money has been invested and allowed them to expand, open the new experimental research lab and a birthing centre. You know, so these are people who are celebrated, they are in demand, they have this kind of power, they're almost treated like, are they like gods or like priests? And they are kind of revered. But it's also the case that their identities are completely entwined. You know, so Beverly and Elliot Mantle, in either version, they never spend any time apart, they live together, they share everything, their identities are completely entwined. In the Cronenberg version, at one point, Elliot has done a surgery and comes back and says to Beverly, "Oh, Bev, you should have been there." And he goes, "I was, you know, because you were there, I was there," basically. Like, they're the same person. And the catalyst to the separation that begins this kind of transitional stage is partly Beverly having a relationship for the first time, a serious relationship. In Cronenberg's film, that's with Claire, who's played by Genevieve Bujold. In the new version, it's Genevieve, in reference to that, I think, played by Brittany Oldford. And this begins a kind of physical and emotional separation between the twins. Now, there's another role for Claire / Genevieve, which is that she is kind of the mutant woman that is talked about. She's infertile. So she's got, in the film, I think, a trifurcated uterus, which I don't believe is a real thing, but she's got 3 entries to her womb, and she's infertile. I think in the new version, bifurcated, so has 2 entries. So again, every little detail about these Dead Ringers is about how do we make women's bodies more permeable. We can have more entrances, we can cut them open wider and keep them open with the mantle retractor tool, you know, and we can operate on them in front of glass windows with an audience so that everyone can see inside. You know, it's all about opening these bodies up. And it's interesting in terms of the idea of rites of passage. When Claire, in the Cronenberg film, learns that she's infertile, she says, "I'll never have been a woman at all, just a girl." You know, it's like she thought she had passed through certain stages in life to become a woman, and now, because of this pronouncement from the doctor, it's like that is taken away. She's reverted back to girlhood. You know, so it becomes a lie because of the doctor's words. Genevieve, in the new version, her reaction is quite different. You know, she shifts, in a sense, to take the masculine role in the relationship and says to Beverly, "I want to put a baby in you." You know, that's the thing that the man does to the woman. Now, they do that through intrauterine insemination using Genevieve's brother's sperm. So the twins are thrown into this liminal space. Their separation kind of, in psychological terms, also throws them into this liminal space, as well as the struggles with fertility in the new version. And it's interesting then, because we start to see, you know, the new centre that they're celebrating here. There's hardly ever rooms, you know, except rooms with windows. When we see the clinic, We're always seeing staircases, corridors. The top picture is the staircase that comes down in the middle of the atrium. The whole clinic is built around an atrium, which in itself is not a room, it's a space between rooms, but we never really are in the rooms. We're always in the atrium or walking along a corridor. You know, it's channels between spaces and never the spaces themselves. There's never a sense of being settled. It's always about, you know, where are we? There's this slight confusion all the time about where we are. There's no inside. And I think there's a similar little note in the Cronenberg film when Beverly, you know, once he's in a relationship with Claire, is looking for a new apartment, goes to this very fancy apartment where there's an open day, and it's very kind of a white, this modern in the 1980s kind of look to the apartment. And he says to the real estate agent, it's very empty. And the estate agent says, well, you could say it's empty or you could say it's clean. You know, and it had this echo to me of talking about an infertile woman's womb. You know, you could say it's empty, you could say it's clean. There's this sense of, you know, that birth is this messy thing, that pregnancy is this messy thing, that abject in terms of women's bodies and their functions. And this empty thing is clean, perfect somehow, pristine. Now, this new centre that the Mantles open in the new version is funded by money from a billionaire. And this is the way that the new series, I think, very kind of blatantly, and I think in a really good way, wants to talk about the state of healthcare in the United States in the 21st century. You know, so this woman in the middle, Jennifer Ayler, is playing the character of Parker, Rebecca Parker, who is part of a family which we are kind of is made very clear is basically the Sackler family. You know, so this family is said to be responsible for the opioid crisis in America, and they're looking for places to put their money. And they're saying, look, the money's in fertility. That's where the money is. This is what people want. They're not very interested in Beverly's talk about birthing in a human-centred birthing centre. They want something that's going to bring in a huge amount of profit, you know, in the future. And they talk about science, but it's not really about science. This is the scene where they all show the Mantles their scars from trepanning, because they're into these kind of weird ideas, you know, where they've had holes drilled in their skull to let out the evil or whatever. You know, they're not into science, they're into making money. And this is, I think, what the programme is talking about. And Beverly, who's sitting there, is disgusted by this, but also wants the money. And they take the money. I think that, you know, there's this debate that's going on. So although it seems like it's the relationship that Beverly has got into that has created the separation and thrown them into conflict, actually this is the more important breaking point, where they decide to take this billionaire's money and compromise the principles, because Elliot is much more excited about, you know, all the research they can do. So Beverly keeps talking about helping women, accessibility, not changing bodies, but reconceptualising problems. So the programme discusses all kinds of issues. I think, you know, we've been discussed in other films that I've seen here this weekend. The menopause, you know, that instead of, you know, Elliot's like, yeah, we can delay it for 20 years by taking stem cells or whatever. Whereas Beverly wants to reconceptualise it, you know, and see it as a development and a stage in life, and not, you know, the end of life, not the end of a woman's period of interest or use in society. But of course, the money is in delaying it. You know, the money is in medicalising and pathologising normal stages of a woman's life. As far as Elliot's concerned, you give people what they want. So she says, if someone wants me to pull a baby out of their belly button while tightening their vagina, I'll do it, you know. And that's what the rich women who come to their clinic want. So this is about modern capitalism. It's about the USA in particular, and about who gets to decide who has access, to care, to treatment, and what kind, and not just that, but what kind of treatment is prioritised. And I think that's a debate that runs through the programme, the new version of Dead Ringers, in a way that it wasn't really there in Cronenberg's. Now, the interesting thing about the liminal stage, the transitional stage, that they've kind of moved into, is that it's in the liminal stage that agency suddenly becomes more important. Because the old rules don't apply, your decisions matter. You know, there's this, everything's thrown up in the air, you have to decide where it's going to go. In both versions of Dead Ringers, the twins spiral once they're separated in different ways, drug use, you know, leading to paranoia, hallucinations, strange dreams, this loss of identity. In Cronenberg's version, there's a bit where, I think it's Beverly, says, "Let me introduce myself, I'm one of the Mantle twins." It's like he doesn't even know which one he is anymore. And of course, through this state of psychological collapse and identity crisis, they keep working, and they keep operating on women. And I'm going to show you a clip from Cronenberg's film. And apologies to anyone who has had any kind of gynaecological exam, because even though this scene is from, it's of poor quality, so apologies for that. This is more than halfway through the film, and so this is Beverly Mantle doing this exam, and he is in a state of collapse and drug use and all the rest of it, but in my experience, this is a pretty accurate depiction of an average gynaecological exam, when I assume that doctors I've had weren't in that kind of crisis, but who knows. Yeah.
This hurts.
I don't know exactly what it is that's hurting.
Mrs. Bookman, this is a solid gold mantle retractor. Solid gold. It's the best there is. This clinic's the best there is. I mean, we have the technology. Couldn't possibly hurt.
I didn't mean to question it.
When did you last have a period?
I haven't had one in 4 or 5 months.
And does it hurt when you have intercourse?
Yes, it does.
Where was I?
You asked me whether or not it hurt when I had intercourse, and I said I did.
What exactly did you have intercourse with?
What do you mean?
I just wondered. I was once asked to treat a woman who had had intercourse with a Labrador retriever. And I thought, maybe. You used this on Mrs. Bookman? Yes. This is not for internals, remember? This is for surgical retraction. No wonder it hurt her. No. It's not the... There's nothing the matter with the instrument. It's the body. The woman's body was all wrong.
Yes. Yeah, I particularly like the way that the patient reacts. You know, you don't want to make a fuss. You think the doctor must know what they're doing. They say, though, it won't hurt. So even though you feel pain, you think, well, it can't hurt. He said it wouldn't hurt. You know, so there's this kind of idea of the relationship between the patient and the doctor. and the power that he has or she has in that relationship. And it's after this point that he designs these instruments for mutant women, because he's decided it's the woman's body that's all wrong. And this is like what we've seen in the opening sequence, the torture devices. Tries to use them in operation, thankfully is stopped, but they come back later on. But also in the new version, we have Elliot, who's working away in her lab, kind of completely off her face on drugs, doing illegal experiments where she's keeping embryos alive much longer than you're allowed to in the United States, and doing all this stuff that is completely unethical in terms of what's currently allowed. They're trying to persist in this priest-like, godlike role, losing any kind of ethical concerns and just continuing to say we are in charge of this process and we know what we're doing, even though as they lose grasp of reality. In episode 5 of the series, we meet another horrible rich family, this time in the southern states of the US. And in this episode, we get this kind of lesson about the history of gynaecology in the States. And the man who's known as the father of gynaecology, J. Marion Sims, who got that title by developing all kinds of techniques, gynecological techniques and surgical techniques in the early 19th century, mid-19th century, by operating on a 17-year-old enslaved woman 30 times without anaesthetic, even though anaesthetic was available, but there was this idea that black people don't feel pain, so these, obviously we don't know from historical records how she felt about any of this, it isn't written down, but he is simply celebrated as this father of gynaecology. Weirdly, thinking about this in the last couple of weeks reminded me of Donald Trump calling himself the father of IVF, trying to make it more available in this weird kind of pro-natalist thing in the United States, which kind of goes against what the anti-abortionists would prefer. And so this episode, in some ways, the new Dead Ringers kind of uses each episode to give a bit of a message about different issues, different aspects of healthcare in the US today. This one is a message to Elliot, really, about, what are you doing playing this godlike role, and look at the history of gynaecology and of medicine. So, going back to Beverly, in the new series, she's pregnant at this point with Genevieve, and her mantra throughout the series has been that pregnancy isn't a disease. And in this episode, in episode 4, her parents come to visit and she shows them round the new Mantle Centre. Her mum calls it a hospital. She's like, it's not a hospital, mum, pregnancy isn't a disease. And the mum says, oh, like in this, oh, isn't it, kind of way. And then you get this episode that's about postnatal depression and her mum's experience of motherhood not being what was promised, not being the experience of pregnancy and then looking after an infant and the rest of it, 2 infants, of course, because she had twins, that this wasn't what she was promised. It's not a role that she was comfortable in. It's not a role that there was any support for other than her husband. And in this one, it raises all of these doubts, about Beverly's kind of idealism about motherhood and how we can just make things easier and everything will run as it should do in nature. But actually, there's all kinds of different levels on which this is a difficult issue for women. It's about the social rules and expectations that Beverly herself now is having to confront as a pregnant person, and is having to think about what she'll be like in the future, how she would be reincorporated, in this new status of mother in society. And through this period, her and Genevieve have broken up, her and Elliot are back together, and you start to see this change. They look like a couple now. So Beverly looks more feminine. She's wearing dresses. Now that she's heavily pregnant. And Elliot is there in a trouser suit. I'm going to be the father of this child. They are playing at these roles, but still in this kind of completely delusional state, really. And I think this comes to the last kind of points, really, about reincorporation, and this idea of what's meant to happen after the liminal stage. Because there isn't really reincorporation. There's none at all in Dead Ringers 88. Arguably, there's some in the new version. In 1988, we see the descent into spiralling drug use, psychological breakdown, getting completely lost in this state of transition. And really, instead of going forward, just reverting to childhood. So you get the twins going, I want some ice cream, and like living in a complete state in their flat and not really getting dressed anymore, and not being able to cope with the idea of how they can move forward. Beverly ends up using the tools for mutant women. The only person he actually uses them on is Elliot. So the mutant woman is a man, his brother. And the final scene of Dead Ringers, Cronenberg's version, Beverly has operated on Elliot, killed him, cut his middle open, and then realised he can't live without him and is lying across him there, but kind of waiting to die himself, But it's almost like a mother and child, the way it looks, like Elliot is the exhausted mother who's just given birth, and Beverly is the child lying across his lap. It's like her kind of re-entering the womb. But the title of this talk was I Have to Climb Inside You Now. That actually comes from the new version, where Beverly asks to die. Ooh. And, the reason this is here is because a review of Dead Ringers that I read in the American magazine called Jacobin pointed out that the ending of the series borrows from some of the kind of post-war twin-themed melodramas, often starring Bette Davis, she said. So I duly looked up Bette Davis twin melodrama and got these two films, one from 1946 called A Stolen Life, and then this one that looks really excellent from 1964, Dead Ringer. In both of them, she plays twins. In the 40s film, there's a good twin and a bad twin, morally speaking, and the bad twin dies, the good twin takes on her life and then ends up with the life that she wanted. In the 60s version, which they say Baby Jane people will adore, which should be most of us here, I think, there's a rich twin and a poor twin. The poor twin kills the rich twin in order to take over her life, only to discover that the rich twin has recently murdered her husband and is about to get caught, so it doesn't go really well. And here's Betty threatening herself. So the ending of Dead Ringers is much more like this. It's this idea that when you have a set of twins, one of them has to die for the other to live. So in Dead Ringers, the film, they both just die. They kind of go back as if they were never existed. In the series, it's different. Here, Beverly asks Elliot to kill her, basically. Please cut me open, take the twins, become me. And so they kind of make that happen. So Beverly's still lying there bleeding out, and this echoes back to a scene in the first episode where there's a black woman who's just given birth to a healthy baby but is talking about pain. She's got internal pain and isn't really listened to, and she ends up bleeding out even in this modern hospital that she's in. And here Beverly bleeds out willingly, and Elliot kind of cuts her own stomach open, so it looks like she's just given birth through cesarean, and assumes Beverly's identity. So it becomes like, I think it becomes a critique, you know. The conclusion is that Beverly has looked at the world she's meant to reincorporate into and decided she doesn't want that. But also I think part of it is about not believing that she can be a good mother, you know, looking at her own mother and thinking about how difficult it was. You know, so it's about both the pressure on women to conform to a particular idea of how they should be, but also about looking at the world as it is, you know, that it's the Parker families who run things and make those decisions really at the end of the day, that Beverly just doesn't want to be a part of. I think it's left very ambiguous what Elliot's role will be as Beverly in the world. You know, Elliot's the one who's happy to accept the Parker's money to do their bidding. You know, but it's left kind of open at the end there, I think. So Beverly, before, you know, she dies, obviously, says, I have to climb inside you now. There was only ever meant to be one of us. You know, this idea, not like mother and child, but like she should have been absorbed in the womb. You know, there should only have been one baby in the first place. So she wants to kind of revert back to nothingness again. So I think that, coming back again to the idea of liminal spaces and horror, I think the horror here is in the spaces in between, you know, in between the status quo ante, you know, the things as they were, and before you get to whatever the new status quo will be, or going back to the status quo with a changed position within it. And that is where a lot of horror lies. It's in that uncertainty, in the lack of rules, in the not knowing where you have to go, and feeling of being lost and trapped. But here, I think in the new version of Dead Ringers, there's also a sense of the horror being in stepping into the new status quo. The horror is in confronting the social rules that you're being trained to accept in the future. You know, so that being in that liminal state and that state of transition reveals the social structures that you're existing inside and makes them more obvious than maybe they were before, you know. And that maybe in this version, that's where the horror really is, and that's why Beverly chooses not to take that step but to go back. So I think in traditional storytelling, you know, the resolution at the end, the reincorporation, is seen as the happy ending because it's always good to go back and become part of society again. In horror, there's often not an ending or a resolution in that simple way, not because that's the scarier thing, but because actually, is that what we want? Is it satisfying to go back to a status quo? You know, so I think that the new version, that Cronenberg's Dead Ringers, leaves us in this scary space of disorientation, you know, where they can't find their way out of the liminal space. But the new version is more about choices of whether you want to be a part of the status quo as we have it. Thank you.